All right, I think we're ready to get started. If Michelle, you want to start the recording. It's recording. Okay, so hello to everyone for coming. We really appreciate you coming and learning about this really important topic. We're so lucky today to have Katherine Peeler, who is a pediatric critical care physician at Boston Children's Hospital. And she's also on faculty at the Harvard Medical School's Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and she is medical director of the Harvard Medical School's Asylum Clinic. She's worked directly with child and adult asylum seekers as well, and has researched, written about, testified, and spoken publicly about the health and rights of asylum seekers. Particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, she's been sought out as an expert in the health of unaccompanied immigrant children for several ongoing legal cases aimed at protecting their health. And just recently, she had an article, in the Health and Human Rights Journal, COVID-19 Asylum and False Binaries of Detention, which I can maybe send the link for later. If everybody wants to, you can share your video if you want. You can not share your video, but we can sort of all be friendly here, and I'll have videos if that's something that people want to do, because we're not scary. Yeah, and if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll kind of look through, and maybe Michelle and Arvin can also help me, some of our board members looking through the chat as well. And other than that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest, who we're very lucky to have.
Hi, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to see if I can still see you guys while I'm in presenter view with my slides, but I might not be able to, so we shall see. Alrighty, I have a feeling that you guys might go away. Oh, no, you're still there. Awesome. Okay, great. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. More than anything in the world, I really like working with students. And so I was excited to give this talk. And so, you know, I've been asked to talk about children specifically, immigrant children and COVID-19. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus on. It's a little bit of a hodgepodge, but you'll see, because I think it's important to kind of give you some context to let you know what I think you can actually do. So first, I just want to talk about child asylum seekers in the United States right now, who they are, a few numbers, things along those lines. Talk about the detained immigrant children specifically, where they're detained, why they're detained, etc. I think we have to touch upon family separation. That's really important, both to know the history as well as to know kind of what's currently going on. And then obviously we'll get into the meat of why we know why it matters in general, but why is it more important right now in the context of COVID-19, talk about some advocacy efforts that are going on right now, and then talk about medical students specifically in these efforts. So I am sure that 95% of you have seen this slide, but I can't help it because I love it. So I'm going to go through it one more time. I go through it every single time I talk about stuff. So for those of you who've not seen it, this is the asylum and kind of refugee process to get into the United States. And I think it's important because sometimes some things get conflated that really need to be separated out. So you will notice on the left, A, B, C, and D. These are different ways of kind of arriving to the United States as a refugee or someone who is seeking asylum. So in A, you have the refugee resettlement process, meaning you're fleeing some sort of official persecution that we as the United States believe is persecution. Before you get here, the US Refugee Agency says, yes, we agree, you should be a refugee, you meet the definition. We give you official refugee status, so you have a legal status before you enter the US, and then you come to the US border. Theoretically, we welcome you with open arms, and we help you resettle. You'll see A, right? So it looks fairly smooth. I wouldn't say it's necessarily easy, but that's, you're allowed in, you've been pre-approved essentially. B, C, and D is asylum. And so there's the affirmative asylum process. So you're fleeing exactly the same persecution as a refugee. It's the same definition actually. But you come in on some sort of valid visa. Maybe it's a student visa or a tourist visa or something else. And then you get into the United States with valid papers. And when you get there, you say, by the by, I would like to seek asylum. And then you kind of go through the whole process, which we're not going to talk about here. Maybe you're granted asylum, maybe you're not, but you've applied for it kind of once you've gotten here proactively. C is what we call arriving asylum seekers. This is still considered affirmative, but it's a little bit different. This is what's mostly all over the news. So these are people who are fleeing persecution, exactly the same thing. But when they get to the border, they do not have a valid set of papers. So they don't have a student visa or a tourist visa or work visa or whatever it is. They have no kind of entry papers, but they get to the border and they say, I want asylum, or I want at least to apply for asylum. And so theoretically, we are supposed to say you're allowed to apply, but because you don't have any valid papers for entering at all, you are going to be detained first. And so you go directly to detention, and then there's a whole process for being able to even allow to apply for asylum, which again, we're not going to cover right this second. Maybe it's successful, maybe it's not. D is also what's all over the news. That's defensive. So you flee persecution, same thing. However, you come in, and either you come in with valid papers, but you don't request asylum, and you overstay your visa or overstay whatever it is your papers are, or you come in without valid papers and you, I hate to use the word sneak, but you kind of come in without people knowing you've come in. And so either way, you are not supposed to be here, in the sense that you never had papers to begin with, and then ICE eventually finds you, or you had valid papers, but you overstayed them and never applied for asylum. So then what happens is that ICE somehow finds you and they start to process your deportation. And then once you're being deported, you say, oh, by the way, actually, I would like to seek asylum. And that's defensive, meaning that you're already in deportation proceedings, but you're asking for asylum. That is much harder to get asylum that way. But you are still allowed to ask, and there's still a process for doing that. So I feel like that's important. We're mostly going to be talking about people in C, but there is, depending on kind of how you arrived and the circumstances by which you applied, different things will happen to you. And this is true for children as it is for adults. So in terms of kids, let me just pay attention to the time here. So in 2017, which is the most recent data, at least that I have, there were around 250,000 asylum applications filed in the United States. Of those, 10%, so 26,000 were granted asylum, so pretty low rate. And of those 26,000, 16,000 of them had applied affirmatively, so kind of what we talked about in that last slide, and 10,000 had applied during removal proceedings. So of the affirmative applications, so people who either arrived and applied right at the border because they had a valid paperwork, or they didn't have valid paperwork and they got detained, but they applied right when they got there. Of that large group, they're really young. And so 30% are straight up children, 17 years or younger. But 50% were 25 years or younger. And I'm not sure how many of you are going into pediatrics or in pediatrics, but those are still children. And I apologize for those of you who are between the ages of 18 and 25. But as someone who works at a pediatric hospital, I would say at any given time, 25% of my patients in the ICU are older than 18. So for all intents and purposes, those are kids, so to speak. Maybe not legally, but certainly in terms of other things. So it is very well known that kids, the children who are seeking asylum have incurred a lot of trauma. So this is a study done by phr where they basically looked at all of the evals that we had done of kids between 2014 and 2018 and went through all of the records to see kind of what types of trauma they had suffered. So almost 80% had suffered direct physical violence. So they had been physically hurt themselves. And this is in their home country. They were around the same percentage. So 70% suffered threats of violence or death. And obviously these are overlapping groups. Almost 20% suffered sexual violence, and then 60% witnessed acts of violence. And for those of you, who've been involved in these cases, that what those acts that they have witnessed are really atrocious. They've sometimes witnessed their parents being murdered or their siblings being killed, like all sorts of really terrible stuff, or their parents being raped. And so this is just in their home countries. You know, I don't have a slide about this, but there is also a ton of trauma that they suffer en route to the United States, whether it's because they are on these large cargo trains and they fall off and they get very seriously injured, or if they are suffer sexual assault along the way. They often are attacked by gangs and other people who steal all their stuff, including sometimes every single piece of their clothing. So they'll be left just naked by the roadside. So there's a lot of trauma along the way, as well as just at home. So who are the kids who are detained? So when you arrive with a parent, if you aren't separated, which we'll get to, then and if you don't have papers, like I had said, then you're going to go to a detention center as a child, and you're going to go to what it's called a family residential center, which makes it sound much nicer than it is, because it's a detention center, and that is run by ICE. And ICE, as I think most of you know, is a law enforcement agency, right? That its main purpose is to enforce immigration law. And so that's who runs these detention centers. The detention centers are owned by private company, like they're managed by private companies, but the rules and regulations are set forth by ICE. And so in this little map, you'll see on the bottom left, from the American Immigration Council, there are currently actually 3, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there are 3 centers. So there's one in Dilley, Texas, in southern Texas. That's the one that I've been to. That was open in 2014 and still remains open today. There is one in Karnes, which is also in southern Texas. That one is open in 2014, also remains open. That one flip-flops back and forth all the time between being a men's only facility, a fathers and kids facility, a women's only facility, a women's and kids facility. That one, for reasons I don't fully understand, it's kind of constantly in flux. The ones in Artesia and Taylor were both shut down for a variety of good reasons. And then there's one you'll see in Leesport, Pennsylvania, that's actually called the Burks Family residential facility. That one's much smaller, and that one's been open for much longer time, since 2001. So that's family detention. And then if you arrive without a parent, or if you arrive with someone that can't prove they're your parent, or the US decides for some reason that you can't be with that person, which we'll get to, then you're officially deemed or if you just arrive by yourself, you are an unaccompanied alien child, which is an unfortunate term, but that's the official term, so UAC. And then you are actually, within 72 hours by law, you have to be transferred out of Customs and Border Protection, like CBP/ICE custody, into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And the reason why that's important is because while ICE is a immigration law enforcement agency, ORR is a part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So they have a very different kind of framework for thinking about things. Again, the kids are still detained, so it's not the same as being a kid who's out in the community and learning and making friends and doing stuff, but the focus and the people who tend to work in ORR are doing it because they took jobs with the Department of Health and Human Services. So it is at least more of a health-oriented agency. Those are really hard to know where they are because they won't release all the places. So this is a map from ProPublica. And actually, if you go to the website, if you just Google ProPublica, ORR shelters, you'll find this. And actually to the left of it, there's a little entry form that says, like, do you know of a shelter? Please let us know, because they're constantly trying to figure out where all the different shelters are. So this is my point being that they're kind of all over the country. They tend to be in areas that are a little bit less populated, so that they're less visual to the public, but there are lots of them. So in terms of family detention, the numbers right now, or the most recent numbers that I have, is that they have really gone down since COVID-19. There's been a lot of pressure to decongregate a lot of these facilities and to release people, which we'll talk about a little bit towards the end. So right now, there are 354 people in family detention, approximately. Obviously, these numbers are a little old. Dilley has 202 people, of which 115 are kids, so a lot of kids. Karnes has 139. It's a little bit even split between adults and children. And then there are, Berks is really small, so 13 currently, 8 adults and 5 children. unaccompanied children, so kind of getting back to them for a minute. So what I was kind of alluding to before is that it's the definition, who decides when it is unaccompanied is essentially the government. So it's a child, this is the official definition, a child who has no lawful immigration status in the United States, so they're not a refugee or something else. They have not attained 18 years of age, and with respect to whom there is no parent or legal guardian in the US, they arrived by themselves, or they can't identify someone who is there for them, or no parent or legal guardian in the United States available to provide physical care and custody. And so that's important because you may arrive by yourself, or you may arrive and the government decides the person with you is not your parent, or they can't prove it's your parent. Or you may arrive with a tiny little piece of paper that says, like, you know, what your mom's name and her phone number, and she lives in Trenton, New Jersey, but she doesn't answer the phone because she is also without papers and too scared to answer. And so then you're left on your own, to no fault of the mother, but to who's just kind of terrified. Or someone is identified who is an uncle and they can't prove it. And sometimes this is for good reason. Like there are a lot of examples of kids being released to, quote, safe sponsors who in actuality are human traffickers posing as family members, or who maybe they are a friend of the family, but in reality, the family did not realize what that person was planning on doing. So the US, you know, it's a balance between trying to protect these kids and being overly, not protective, but keeping them from their actual family. But a lot of times kids are taken away when they shouldn't be. So anyway, they then fall under the custody of DHHS, like I had mentioned, and then and then the kind of trickles down to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So just in last year alone, there were, to give you some numbers, almost or more than 67,000 referrals. So that does not mean that at one time there's 67,000 kids in these shelters. That means over the course of the year, 67,000 unaccompanied children were referred to ORR. But you'll see how big the numbers are. It's up from 13,000 in 2012. So at any given time, there's around 2,400 children in ORR custody. It's a little bit different now in the context of COVID-19, but that's an average amount at any time. 2/3 tend to be boys. They are primarily in decreasing order from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and then many, many fewer, like 3% are from Mexico, and then an even tinier percentage are from the rest of the countries in the world. There are, in terms of age group, around 2/3 are 15 to 17, so kind of older kids. 12% are 13 to 14, but then still a large percentage, so 16% are 0 to 12. So those are really young kids, and those are considered tender age children. That's like kind of the official term, which I find sad and telling. And so what are these facilities? So there's 4 different types of official places. There's shelters, group homes, staff secure shelters, and residential treatment centers. So shelters are kind of catch-all type of place where they are, kids live, eat, have their schooling, kind of do everything in these kind of self-contained centers. And so they are still detained, but they kind of receive all the services they need. Theoretically. Group homes are what they sound like they are. They're smaller versions of shelters. Staff secure shelters are for children who are either a danger to themselves or to others. And then residential treatment centers, of which there are the fewest number, are for children who have even more mental health needs than the general UAC population, of which everyone has some mental health needs, because the reason why they're leaving is because they've suffered trauma. One of the things to keep in mind is that a lot of kids who end up at staff secure shelters, what they really need is an RTC. And the reason why they are a threat to themselves and to others is because they have such severe needs, but they don't get them because they don't go to the RTCs. And so there gets to be kind of a cycle of these kids not being helped in the ways that they need. And if you're interested in learning more, there was a really interesting Office of Inspector General report published in last September that basically reviewed the mental health, what the actual mental health apparatus is for these various places, and what's currently happening. And it didn't actually say that they're not meeting their requirements, because they probably didn't want to step on any toes, but they basically presented all the data. And so the only conclusion is that they're obviously not meeting their own requirements. And so like there's very specific mental health timelines that people are supposed to be following, and they aren't, partially because they aren't, partially because they can't, because there's a lot of attrition of staff, because it's a very hard place to work. So other things that are affecting unaccompanied children right now is that, I'm sure most of you know, on March 20th, the director of the CDC put out an order that basically closed all of our southern and northern land and coastal borders. One second, sorry. So he closed all the land and coastal ports of entry, but only to, it's very specifically worded, and I didn't put it out here because it's really lengthy, but you can actually either just read the order, which I encourage you to do, or you can read that paper that was mentioned at the beginning of this talk, which talks about it. But basically, it only applies to people who are arriving without legal entry papers, so i.e. people who are seeking asylum. And the reason that he gives is that because all those people are going, by definition, must be detained, you are going to put them in a congregate facility, and so therefore it's going to increase the spread of COVID, and so it's not in the best interest of the public health, and so he invoked the Public Health Services Act to close the borders for that reason, just to that specific population. But the borders are open to people who are riding in airplanes. Their borders are open to people who are crossing those same borders, but for other, so those same ports of entries, but for other reasons, such as education or commerce or trade or other things where COVID it's definitely spreading. And so it's really discriminatory. And so since then, since he did that, essentially and these numbers are old. These numbers are 2 weeks old, so I'm sure that they are much more. But more than 21,000 people have been expelled. And expelled, at least I find it a confusing word, does not mean that you've like physically entered way into the country and then we push you out. It means that you present yourself to the border and then we push you out. But technically, by virtue of being on the border, you're in our country, even if we hadn't let you walk 1 inch further inward. So 21,000 people have basically not been allowed to even ask for asylum, of which more than 1,000 have been unaccompanied children. I wrote children, but that's actually not true. I should have written unaccompanied children. Many, many more children than 1,000, but more than 1,000 were unaccompanied children. So as I mentioned, it's discriminatory, which makes no sense from a public health perspective. It doesn't actually protect the public health. You don't need to do it, which I didn't write here, in the sense that you don't actually have to detain anyone. So CBP has both the authority and the discretion to detain no one if they want to. It's not a law, you have to be detained, or a rule. It's just the current process. But if they decide not to detain someone, if they want to use an alternative to detention, to either parole someone and put an ankle monitor, which also sucks for a lot of reasons, or do something else, they are absolutely within their right to do that. And so they don't have to use detention. They could do lots of other things that would allow people to both process their asylum applications and also protect public health. And then I'm not a lawyer, so I guess I can't say it's illegal, but it's verging on illegal as far as I can tell. And certainly people are challenging it in court. So it violates the 1967 Refugee Protocol, which we are a signatory of. It violates our own law, the 1980 Refugee Act, which protects not only the right to apply for asylum, but the right of non-refoulement. So basically, we agree to never send you back to a dangerous situation. And then in terms of children, it directly violates the 2008 Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is an act, it's all-encompassing. It has a lot of different protections for trafficking victims, but essentially the part of the act states that if you think that someone's at risk of trafficking, there's due process that they are entitled to in terms of making sure that they are protected until you can get them out of that situation. So by definition, any single unaccompanied child who arrives at our border is at risk of trafficking, and because it happens all over the border, especially, and that's been proven in terms of the migrant protection protocols. And so by not allowing them to even come in and process their asylum claim, we are violating that law, like, egregiously. And so that's all being worked up in court. So family separation, what about the kids who come with their families? So, as much as we like to blame everything on our current administration, I just want to give a little bit of credit is probably the wrong word, but spread the love and the fact that it's like, this is not a new policy. Our current president certainly is doing a great job being the worst person in the world, but he didn't start it. In 2005, so this is several presidents ago, under President Bush, that's kind of when we started a lot of these residential centers. You saw that one of them actually was even built in 2001. So they started increasing prosecutions for illegal border crossings, and they started keeping families together in these residential family centers. And then in 2014, there was the beginning of what's now known as the surge. So essentially, where it had predominantly been single young men who were crossing the border looking for work, it kind of shifted to a lot of families and a lot of unaccompanied children arriving at the southern border. And that's for a lot of political and historical reasons. And so you'll see that even between 2013 and 2014, there was an enormous increase in the number of families that were apprehended by CBP at the border. So then under President Obama, we started doing shifting away from these smaller shelters to these larger family detention centers. And there was a lot of uproar about this. This is why we talked about how Artesia was closed and that other place was closed. A lot of this was because under that administration, they were trying to get family residential centers accredited as like childcare facilities and daycares, because education and other things happen there. And so there was a lot of uproar about that. And so some of them were closed. But that's when a lot of these other ones were built and were started in 2014. Then our administration had the wonderful idea of separating kids from their family. So that was in July 2017. Trump thought it'd be great to trial family separation as an official policy in El Paso as a deterrent model, to say that, you know, if the word gets out that we're separating kids and families, maybe people will stop coming. And so they trialed it. They seemed to think that there were fewer numbers of people arriving at the border. This is a very short trial, and decided it was a raging success. And so it was rolled out officially on May 7th as an actual policy. And then I'm sure you all remember there was an enormous amount of anger from basically every single person in the country about this policy. Even his supporters were just aghast at watching all these really young children being separated from their parents. And so just in the 6 weeks that it was officially in process, more than 2,800 kids were separated from their families, and they really were basically kidnapped, which I think I'll talk about in further slides. So that was, May 7th. Then by June 20th, under a lot of pressure, including from his wife, there was an executive order to basically halt family separation. But what he proposed was instead to detain families forever, indefinitely, which is also illegal because that would violate the detention limits which currently exist for kids, at least under the Flores Settlement Agreement, which is a really big agreement from 1997 that basically states all of the rights and care that are due to children who are in U.S. custody, either in family detention or in ORR custody. And there's a lot of things in there, but one of them is the detention limits. And so you can't just keep people detained indefinitely. So meanwhile, there was another federal lawsuit that actually had been going on for 6 months that said, like, that executive order is nice and all. However, you also need to, now I'm officially telling you, and in the courts, you have to stop separations, and you have to reunify people. You can't just stop separating them. And you have to allow contact while you're waiting to reunite them. And it just wasn't that simple, because they basically had not kept track of where anyone was going. And so it was a huge disaster, frankly, trying to reunite people, which eventually was largely done, but not after a large amount of work. And so this has been bad for kids, which you could imagine. And so PHR did a report recently, actually came out just before COVID broke, so there actually was a decent amount of press around this. This was in February. I should say before COVID broke in the United States. And so they made this report, You Will Never See Your Child Again. And all these reports you can download from PHR's website. But essentially they looked at, it's a small step, but they looked at 26 evaluations performed by PHR clinicians between July 2018 and August 2019. And these were specifically evaluations where the primary question was about the effect of family separation. So these evaluations were not specifically for their asylum claim, but they were because there was some problem that directly related to separation. And I did several of these. And so there were 17 adults and there were 9 children. And basically what they found is that, as we already knew, families were fleeing physical violence. Most of the parents left because they were worried about their child's safety. The families were forcibly separated at the border, and they were not really told why. There definitely was no good reason. They were given no due process. They really, really were worried they were never going to see each other again. Kids were sent all over the country. So all those ORR shelters that you saw, compare that map to those 3 shelters, the 3 family residential centers that you saw on the other map. So the kids were sent hundreds of thousands of miles away from their families, and they didn't know where they were. Not surprisingly, the detention conditions weren't great. And then the thing that really happened a ton is that the parents couldn't pass this very important interview. So in that very first slide that I showed you about the asylum process, I showed you how some people come in and they immediately get into detention. And so before you're even allowed to apply for asylum, you have to pass this credible fear interview, which basically is a kind of pre-screener interview where you have to show that you have a credible fear, which has a specific legal definition, that if you return to your home country, something terrible will happen to you. You'll be murdered, you will be targeted for whatever reason, and it has to be on account of certain grounds. But if you fail that interview, then you're deported. You're not even allowed to apply for asylum. So it's a very, very important interview. And all of these parents were failing their interview because basically they would arrive on day 1. On day 2, their kids would be essentially kidnapped. They would have no idea where they went or for how long. And then on day 4, they would have their CFI. And so they just couldn't answer the questions because they were just so distraught. And all of their answers, instead of answering the questions, their answers would just be questions back to the interviewer saying, you know, where is my kid? And so it was really awful. These are just some quotes that I think are important because, you know, we're talking about kids, but kids, you know, are part of families. And so the 17-year-old talked about how he missed his dad and didn't know whether he was alive or not. Can you imagine not knowing if your parent is alive? This is like the second one is a psychologist who's describing a mom from El Salvador. The psychologist says she asked the official why her daughter was being taken away from her. The official reportedly responded that her daughter was going to be adopted by an American family and she would be deported and never see her daughter again. I mean, I can't imagine. And so I'll let you read these on your own and read the report on your own. But the point being that people were really distraught. This is a little boy who actually was separated and then eventually was deported and reunited with his father in Guatemala, but his mother was still in the US. And so his family was all over the place. And, you know, you can just see his face. He just, it's awful. And we're just adding trauma. So the thing that's important to know, so if you remember, I told you that that policy ended in 6 weeks after it started, so in late June of 2018. This is the numbers as collected by PHR of migrant children who were separated from their parents from July 2017, so when that little El Paso trial started, up until the study ended, which was December 2019, so just recently. And so you'll remember I said that there was around 2,200 or 2,800 or some number of kids detained, separated during those first 6 weeks. But it continued. So despite the fact that they were supposed to be stopped, they found various other reasons for separating children from their families. And so from that time, there have been over 5,500 kids, I'm sure it's more now, who've been separated. And if you look at the age group, 2,300 were younger than 10. Those are really young kids. I don't know if you guys have kids or if you take care of kids, but kids who are, kids of any age should not be separated from their children, but a 10-year-old or a 6-year-old, they're just not going to understand what's happening. And on the right, essentially is just about the really young kids. So 300 were 0 to 5. Both of my kids are 0 to 5, so I just can't even imagine what that means. And then the other thing, this is not very surprising, but still important to publish. These are the mental health disorders of the people in this study. And so these are the adults. Most of them had PTSD, you'll see. A lot had depression, a lot had anxiety, and it seemed that a lot of it was really compounded by the family separation itself. So obviously it's hard to delineate what's from your trauma at home versus what's from your trauma at from separation of your child, but a lot of what they were describing, a lot of their trauma was from the actual separation. Same with kids. So these kids who are all quite young, most of them had PTSD, and then a fair number had depression and anxiety. And then the thing that I also think is really important for you to take away from this is that what PHR found is that this policy actually met the official, like, international definitions of torture. So it has to be something that causes severe mental or physical suffering, check. Is done intentionally, check. It was an actual policy. For the purposes of coercion, punishment, intimidation, or discriminatory reason, this was an official deterrent policy. So we were coercing and punishing and intimidating people by a state official or with state consent or acquiescence. So it meets all of these easily. So we are officially torturing people. And it also met the definition of enforced disappearance, which is any deprivation of liberty by the state where there is concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person. So again, this is kind of a fancy word for kidnapping, but we did not tell families where their kids were. So they didn't know for weeks at a time where their kids were, and vice versa. So not to bog you down with sad news, but this is still happening, but just under a different form. And so more recently, before we kind of closed our borders, DHS, and this was all over the news, had been forcing families who were arriving at the border. They made it sound like they were doing this for their good, but that they had to choose. You can either stay in detention indefinitely, which no one wants to do, period, and they definitely don't want to do when there's a pandemic raging. No one wants to be in a congregate facility. Or if you don't want to do that, because you want to protect your health, then you can just give us your child, and we'll take them into our custody, and you can be deported. And so a lot of families said no, like, I don't think so. And so they somehow were able to get in touch with legal outfits and the press. And so this definitely was happening and probably is still happening, although again, we're not really letting anyone in right now with the CDC order. So they continue to find ways to creatively take children from their families. So what about COVID-19 in ORR settings? So some of these news clips are older, they're from March, but the point being that, not surprisingly, as many of us predicted, it was eventually going to reach these facilities. So originally it was just 3 workers who were in an ORR facility who tested positive. Then it was 7 people who tested positive at one of the Houston shelters, ORR shelters. And then there was a huge outbreak, and you'll see this is mid-April, at a Chicago shelter. And again, this is back when we thought, like, I don't know, not that big of a deal for kids to get coronavirus, before we kind of really knew about the multi-system inflammatory, I can't remember if this is a silly name. This is before we actually knew that it can cause problems in kids, right? So this bothered us because they were exposing kids unnecessarily, but I think we would have been even more outraged if we'd known, like, what a risk it can be for otherwise healthy children. And having seen several of these MISC children now, I can tell you it's not fun, and it's very scary. So it continues. And the other thing I should tell you about the ORR settings of things that were going on is that in addition to being directly affected by the actual virus, there were a lot of other things that were going on. So even though, the Department of Health and Human Services stated that kids who are in ORR custody really should be practicing social distancing, using hand hygiene, and like all that stuff, and like not going out unless necessarily. Whereas the Executive Office of Immigration Review, who is the kind of legal side of immigration, said you still have to come in for your court proceedings, like in person. Like they weren't closing them yet, and so because it's under a different branch, and so they had these conflicting asks. One was one by the state of New York and OR was saying shelter in place almost, and the other one was saying if you don't show up, you're going to be deported. And so then that was very scary and confusing, both for kids as well as for their lawyers who had to show up in these very, very crowded courtrooms. And then it was also hard because then they tried to start doing it via Zoom. But then you would have these 5-year-olds trying to have a court case, which doesn't make any sense anyway, but then having it via Zoom with an interpreter and a judge, and it was just a mess, really scary. And other things they were doing in ORR shelters is that when they needed to quarantine a kid, they would put them essentially in solitary confinement because they couldn't quite figure out how to do it otherwise. And then the last important thing to mention is that, again, maybe not being infected directly with the virus, but a lot of these kids were really scared for their families back home. At this point in March and April, it hadn't quite hit as much of South and Central America, but now, we know it's raging kind of everywhere, uncontrolled, particularly in Central and South America. And so a lot of kids have no idea what's going on with their families at home. They're not getting enough information. And so they're scared. They know that there's a pandemic of sorts, but they don't have a lot of information about it. And they don't know what's going on with their home country's response. And that's the other thing with the CDC order, is that we're essentially just creating a different public health crisis by not allowing people in and making them stay in countries that have even fewer resources than we do from a public health and health perspective. And so all of this essentially is just like a compounding of mental health trauma. So they were already having lots of mental health traumas compounded between their home country, en route, in the detention centers, and then now obviously living in a detention center in the context of a pandemic. So so we'll switch to some good news. So what's been happening? So there've been a lot of court cases. So I mentioned that Flores settlement agreement. So that's kind of like an ongoing case forever. So there was a settlement agreement about what is due to children in U.S. Immigration custody, and anytime there's a violation of that, the court case kind of gets reopened and reevaluated, etc. And so Judge Dolly G, who is the primary judge who thinks about and reviews and makes sure that the settlement agreement is being complied with, she reviewed another case recently, which was Flores versus Barr, so William Barr. And essentially she found that ICE and ORR were in violation of the Flores settlement agreement by virtue of not letting kids out sooner in the context of a pandemic, and kind of a lot of things. And so she mandated speedier release. And so now kids need to be, basically almost everyone should be released by June 15th. Whether or not they will be, I don't know, but that's kind of the latest status of that. Concurrent case that's been going on, and I wrote declarations for both. I wrote a declaration for the first case, and then I was part of an amicus brief for the second case, was this OMG versus Wolf. And OMG is just some person's initials, and versus Chad Wolf. And so this one was for families. So the first one just covers children, and the second one covers basically the adults that come with those children. And so this one was being ruled on by Judge James Boasberg of DC, who basically has continued to follow Judge Dolly G's orders. So he also ordered ICE to release families unless there was a justifiable reason for continued detention. And so that's why the numbers have been so low. You saw how at Berks in particular, the numbers are quite low. And so people are being released. ICE is trying to find reasons to not release people, but we are working very hard to do that. And there's a ton of other cases too in terms of getting other adults out, but these are the ones that pertain to children. And then I think something that's important just to keep you aware of it also is that not everyone who works for the government or in the government is a terrible person, right? So there are government attorneys, there's judges, there's asylum officers, there are clinicians who work at these places, there's people who are kind of caregivers or are shelters. And a lot of them have gone into their job because they want to help people, whether it be adults or children. And a lot of them have legal mandates to protect children by virtue of whatever it is that they do. But at the same time, they have to follow these policies that directly don't help children. So policies that lead to deportation, that lead to access of medical care, or to remove them from family members. And so they are really stuck trying to figure out whose orders to follow and how, like, do they follow their professional code of ethics or do they follow their direct, employer's orders? And it gets very confusing. A good example is that immigration judges, so they have a legal mandate to exercise independent judgment, right? They're judges. And that's premised on the fact that the judiciary is separated from the legislative and executive branches. But immigration court is part of the executive branch. It's actually not part of the judicial branch. And so its judges actually report to the U.S. attorney, like that's their boss. And the U.S. attorney is the person who instructs government attorneys to prosecute and deport immigrants. So it's very hard to really be truly neutral given the kind of chain of command. And this is just one of like a million examples of how hard it is to kind of work within this system. This is just an example that was up a while ago. Let me see what time it is. Perfect. Of Geo Group, which is one of the private groups that runs these ICE family shelters, was seeking. They put an ad up in JAMA, which was promptly taken down. But So you'll notice that the salary is $400,000. For those of you who've not applied for jobs yet, I will just warn you that that's not what you're going to be paid when you leave residency, for the most part, except for those of you who are going to be OMF physicians and, PGY 1,000. But the average income for a doctor is not $400,000 in their first year, and certainly not someone who, like a lot of these are, you only need, for a lot of these jobs, you only need to be board eligible. They don't even care if you're board certified. So anyway, and it's, it says, this ad said that it wants someone who can examine and treat detainees, and provide care, blah, 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 but also be philosophically committed to the objectives of the facility. That's very hard to do that, right? And so there was a lot of uproar about this, and so JAMA took it down. And so what about medical students? So this is just, I love medical students as my little heart. My son, who you heard in the background, did not approve of this heart. He thought the cursive heart was no good, but I overruled him. But this is just a very tiny list of many medical students who I've worked with. So I apologize for those of you who I left off, who have done really amazing work on behalf of immigrants. And so to those of you who are here, thank you. I'm sure lots of you are doing stuff that I don't know about. But I think it's important to talk about, like, what have they done, and what can you do? Because you can do a lot. So I would encourage you to make a lot of noise. That's mostly what I do all day. So you can write. So you'll see that piece on the Hill that we just published recently. That was 3 medical students from Harvard, myself, and they really did the bulk of the writing by far. And it's a great piece, and it calls ICE out for basically being responsible for the deaths of several people in their custody from COVID-19 who clearly were showing symptoms and should have gone into medical care earlier. Those same writers have another piece coming out soon. So I would encourage you to write op-eds and other things. On the bottom right, you'll see the PHR blog. A lot of you write really great things there, and I think it's important to write those, to read those, and to post them. On the upper right, you'll see just one student who does a lot of tweeting. So I think it's important to promote that stuff. And then on the left, like, you still can, obviously you can still protest and make noise, even in the era of social distancing, either like by car parades and other things like that. And sat someone down most recently, like in the last month, down near Carnes. So you see it says DHS, ICE, GEO, the eyes of Texas are upon you. And so I just encourage you to do a lot of writing. And for those of you who are interested, I'm always happy to read things and help figure out where the best medium is, and etc. But make sure that you write, and make sure when you write, you promote it. Evidence, right? PHR is an evidence-based group. And so that's like their entire mission. And so I really encourage you, and we could talk about this if we have time, but to think about, like, what do we know, right? There's a lot of things that we like feel and we're like pretty sure are true because they seem obvious, but do you know it? Like, are you sure? Is there actual evidence, or is just like kind of what you think? Like, you think detention probably sucks, but like, do you actually know it sucks? And so I encourage you to think about what you know. What do you think you know, but you have yet to prove, or someone else has yet to prove? And then how can you find out those answers? Either through investigation, right? So either through like working with it, like in a kind of a journalistic style, or through actual research. There's a lot of research questions that you could ask with relation to not just COVID-19 and immigration, but detention, family separation. So I would encourage you to look at some of PHR's reports and see the types of research that they've done, and just think of, like, what things do you want to answer, and then how would you answer them? And then you're welcome to reach out to me, or I'm sure there are tons of people at your institution who would help you do those research projects. But I'm working on a research project right now with some students, and it's going to be great, and I think it's going to answer a lot of important questions. And the hope is that the answers to those questions actually influence policy. And then when you're doing that, so you also want to think about what's the best way to disseminate that evidence. So is it in reports that you then put in front of Congress, or the WHO or the UN or whoever, or is it through medical articles, or is it through calling New York Times and telling your findings? But you really want to make sure that it makes a difference, that your research is doing something. So just 2 good examples that I encourage you to look at. This just came out a couple days ago. Eric Reinhardt is a student, although he's not a medical student. He's a PhD in medical anthropology, or maybe just social anthropology, I forget, but anthropology nonetheless. And so they did a zip code analysis of jail cycling in Cook County. And it's a really elegant, short study that basically showed that jail cycling accounted for an enormous percentage of de novo cases of COVID-19 in Chicago, much more than race or hypertension or many other kind of associated risk factors. And so it's a great example of research that was fairly easy. Like the data was already there. They just collected it from publicly known sources, and then they analyzed it, and then they wrote it up, and now they're promoting it everywhere. Another great example of research, really easy and elegant, but super important and being cited every 5 seconds, is this study by the U.S. Immigration Policy Center from Southern California, which basically here, they went across the border. This was obviously earlier in the year, and they interviewed a lot of people who were stuck in Mexico from the Migrant Protection Protocol, or Remain in Mexico Protocol, Remain in Mexico program, and asked lots and lots of different questions. But one particular statistics that's quoted all the time, including by me, I use it all the time, is that of all the people they interviewed, which were hundreds of people, 92% of them have family members or very close friends in the United States that they could stay with. Meaning you don't need to detain any of these people. They all could come across, be paroled, and then have somewhere safe, either just to stay in general, which is when this is published, or now in the context of COVID, where they could quarantine easily and not need a detention center. And so that type of easy statistic is extremely helpful in a lot of policy decisions. And what can you do right now? So besides writing and protesting and considering about research, all of which I encourage you to do. So the immigration courts, not all, but a lot of them were closed for a long time. They're starting to reopen, and immigration cases are starting to happen. I know a lot of you are at schools that have asylum clinics, and probably a lot of your evaluations were on pause, or maybe some of them were going forward, but now you're gonna have a lot more requests coming through. And so I encourage you to really start getting those going again. If you can do them remotely, and for those of you who have not done those yet, there's webinars that were recorded by PHR on how to do those. Primarily, it's for psychiatric and evaluations or psychological evaluations, because that lends itself much more to a remote evaluation, although there are methods of doing physical evaluations remotely, which are beyond the scope of this talk, but you could certainly look at PHR's webinars for that. So for a lot of those legal cases I wrote about, we've been asked to write expert declarations. So literally where you write, like, very formally why it's bad to be in a detention center with COVID-19, either as a child or as an adult. And so we've written declarations in general, like it's bad in general, or we've written declarations for specific people. You know, like Joe Smith should not be in detention because he has lupus and is on chronic steroids and is at higher risk of infection, or whatever it is. And so those are really, really helpful. I've worked with a lot of incredible medical students for these, actually primarily at UI Chicago, who've helped with a lot of background research in various expert declarations, and it just saves you an enormous amount of time to have students helping you. And so I would encourage you to do that. And if there's physicians at your center who you think might want to do that, reach out to them and ask if they're interested, you know, and you could work on that with them. And again, it could be for individual cases, and it can be for like large cases. And then the other thing is that whether you have just one hospital affiliated with your medical school or many hospitals, you can pick the one that you like the most, but almost every single hospital in the country has an Office of Legislative Affairs, especially large academic centers, that basically is where the hospital does its advocacy work through. You may not agree with all their advocacy efforts, but depending on your hospital, if they have ones that seem like they are pro children in terms of, like, you know, getting people out of detention and things along those lines, then it's a really nice kind of easy way of starting to actually go talk to your state legislature and going down to DC. And oftentimes, you know, those offices of legislative affairs at hospitals don't know anything about students. Like, they know their go-to physicians and maybe a couple residents, but they certainly don't tend to know tons of students. And so I'm sure that they would be happy to have you be involved. And that's a lot easier way of getting in the door of your state legislature, because the door is already open for them. You're just kind of going in with them. And so that's a nice way of starting to do some advocacy in conjunction with people who already have a lot of research done. And I think that's it. I left a few minutes for questions, but I'm always happy to be emailed. The caveat that I give every single person is that I am terrible at email. So if I don't write back to you in a few days, you're welcome to write every 3 days. I won't think that you're annoying. It will make me eventually write back to you. And I'm honestly happy to talk to anyone and happy to be emailed 1,000 times. I just get behind. And then if you're on Twitter, which is the only social media thing that I currently use, feel free to follow me or vice versa. And I think that's where I'll leave it for right now. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. I think some people already have a couple of questions, sort of on different points, some of which you sort of reached later in the lecture, but we'll pose it anyway. So Yael asked about what type of documents are required to prove parenthood, specifically.
Sure. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, I lost my mute button. I don't know where it went. Okay, what kind of documents are needed to prove parenthood? That's a great question. I don't know. I don't want to lie and tell you. But oftentimes so it depends. I will say it depends on the asylum officer. So same thing as like when you go to the airport, and sometimes you get a super nice person when you come through customs when you're traveling internationally, and sometimes you get someone who is mildly terrifying. It's the same with asylum officers. They're very different, and they have discretion to ask for and not certain things. And so sometimes they will ask a child or a parent for their birth certificate. Sometimes they won't, and not everyone has a birth certificate. I certainly don't know where mine is. So it depends, but essentially I think that they just look for kind of matching papers in terms of like matching identity cards that actually kind of makes sense. But a lot of times it's nothing, and a lot of times it's more than it needs to be. But I can ask if there's I can ask my lawyer friends about if there's like a minimum that they're supposed to be asking for.
I can support with that question a little bit.
Sure.
I'm Sophia, psychiatry resident in Chicago. I work with volunteer capacity with one of the child facilities in Chicago. I think for proving a relationship, if it's immediate family, generally a birth certificate is enough. Fingerprinting can be added on. However, I have heard of them doing DNA testing, depending on the case. And so as you move further out of immediate family, like if their sponsor is a family friend, they may require like photo proof, where they're both, the child and the person are both in the photo. And usually, I think that's the extent to which I've been exposed to. But Dr. Peeler, the way you said, I think it's completely up to them in terms of discretion for what they decide or how suspicious they are in the moment about who that sponsor is.
Great, thank you for jumping in. So another question that was posed, which we sort of touched on a little bit later, was regarding the interview process, if there is a form of clinical psychological trauma assessment used for the legal decision-making or to ascertain the capacity and need for legal counsel. So that would be maybe before, someone like a PHR would step in. Is there sort of something automatic, I think is the question.
There's absolutely nothing automatic, which is a huge problem, especially because a lot of people have just endured a lot of really severe trauma. And so I don't know, but I suspect if someone is floridly psychotic, maybe that's a little bit different, but short of that, the answer is no. And so actually most of what we were doing, all those 2060 evaluations that we talked about in that study, not all, but majority of them were requested by attorneys at Dilley and other places, saying these mostly mothers failed their credible fear interview. They're about to be deported. Can you do an evaluation strictly of their psychological assessment strictly about the effects of their separation? We're not trying to get them asylum here. It's not like an overall psychological assessment. We want to know how the family separation affected their ability to do their CFI. So that's what I was doing. So I basically, did a very brief history of their trauma at home, but really focused on what the experience was like to be separated, and then what the experience was like during their CFI, and then wrote what seemed like an obvious conclusion, but had to be written nonetheless, that they were not in any appropriate psychological state during that CFI to answer the questions clearly, because they were so distraught about being separated from their child, they couldn't focus. And so I forget if I recommended or not, since I don't tend to make legal recommendations, but the recommendation was that they either be allowed to redo their CFI or that it just be kind of thrown out, but that they not be deported with the kind of official negative CFI on their record, since they didn't actually get the chance to do it correctly. That was only because those attorneys advocated for that for them. They would not have gotten that on their own otherwise.
Great. And I think, so 2 more questions. One, I'll just, because it's sort of an add-on to, well, similar field as that question, was about what mental health provisions are available for children.
Yeah, so that I would encourage you to read, not that I'm dodging the question, it's just that there's a lot more to that, but I would encourage you guys to Google that Office of Inspector General report about mental health services in or our facilities. I forget the title, but if you just Google that, you'll find it. It was in September of last year. And essentially, there are provisions. So everyone is supposed to get a screening evaluation when they first come in. This is OR specifically. This is not necessarily ICE and family detention. And then there is a set schedule for how frequently children are supposed to be seeing mental health counselors. And then there's also a set schedule for, like, if there's concern, then they need to see, you know, someone else within a certain period of time. And so maybe they're seeing a mental health social worker at first, because that's who's contracted with the OR facility, but it seems like they have more severe needs, then they are supposed to see a psychologist or psychiatrist and see someone from externally, because not all those people are contracted with OR. But there are very specific timelines and time schedules, and they just aren't followed. And what the OIG found actually is not because the mental health counselors, you know, weren't doing a good job, because their caseloads were enormous. They had tons of cases. And then it seemed like, as best they could tell, that they also would get overburdened and overworked. And so then they would quit. And so you'd have a period of time when there was no one, or you'd have someone who had even more cases. And so it just, and also there were times when children were supposed to be seen by outside, like external contracted mental health providers, and they couldn't find one like close to that facility, like in a reasonable time. And so in general, the mental health services are prescribed but insufficient.
And then we're going to do just one more question. I know other people asked, but just in the interest of time. One question that was asked was whether there's been efforts to sue third-party or otherwise medical providers in these facilities for their failure to provide appropriate care, citing experience of a young person being placed in quarantine for 2 weeks, having a positive PPD despite having a BCG vaccine.
Oh yeah, I kind of remember that case. Yes, the short answer, yes, there has been efforts to sue. I don't know if they've been to sue the medical providers. I would have to look. I'd have to ask phr. I don't know if the efforts were to sue the actual medical providers, or if it was to sue ICE for not providing appropriate medical resources. So in one of the pieces that some students and I just wrote that hopefully will be out in the next day or two, one of the sections we talked about was not that ICE should be providing more medical care within its facilities, but that it needs to be providing more access quicker and more frequently to medical care outside its facilities. Like it's not a medical care facility, right? And so there are clinicians of some type there sometimes, but there is a disincentive to send people to outside EDs and clinics because they have to pay for that. And so they meaning like ICE or CoreCivic or, these other GEO group. And so they don't want to pay for that. And so they keep people longer. And then by the time they need care, they're oftentimes in extremis. And so not all the time, but certainly more often than not. And so what we argued in this paper is that there needs to be independent oversight and there needs to not be financial incentives to keep people, and there needs to be independent oversight about the medical care and medical triage done in ICE. And so I don't know about suing the actual providers. I suspect that they are probably named in the cases, but I don't know if it's them versus naming the overall system or the system that ends up being sued. Usually it's a system. I don't know if the providers are listed or not. And another thing that's interesting that comes up a lot is whether people should be working in the facilities. I know I should have a strong opinion. I don't, because I guess I could see, I will tell you that many attorneys who work in these facilities would say that physicians should not be working in these facilities. Like if you just stop working there, then if everyone stops working there, then there will be no care there, and then they will have to close them down. And I don't disagree with that. I don't know it's very hard as an actual medical provider to do that and know that meanwhile there's some people languishing who are not receiving any care while you're trying to quote wait it out. So I think it depends why you're taking that job, right? Like there are some people who really take the job. There are people who take the job because it pays $400,000, right? And so that's probably not the right reason to take the job. But there are people who take the job who really want to work in that context, and they probably feel really terrible about making $400,000, but maybe they're doing it really for the right reasons. And they're trying to make care better. So I would hate to paint like broad brush strokes on every single person who works there, and by there I mean like all these different places, right? Like there's a lot of there's a mixture of well-intentioned and unwell-intentioned people at all these places. And then just quickly, Vikram, I can answer your question later, but I don't know. I like the genocide question. I'm going to ask phr.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opinions on the genocide question, whether it applies or not, and you can look at a lot of work done on that question. I've looked at it more internationally, but there's definitely healthy discussion about that topic.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to say thank you to everyone for coming today. I want to encourage you to reach out to the PHR student group if you want to pursue things further. We are actively developing, especially our child and human rights sort of work right now, trying to help connect people with mentors, trying to do more work in this field. So if that's something that interests you, please feel free to reach out or look at our website. We have a place to register to receive more information about that, and this lecture will also be there if you want to refer to this excellent lecture later on. Thank you so much to Dr. Peeler for really sharing her wealth of information with us in such a concise and easily accessible way. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you. It was fun. You'd be able to email me over and over.
Thank you.